I'm with Dr. Dimitris Xygalatas, a scholar of religious studies. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Andrew. I'm Dimitris Xygalatas. I'm an anthropologist and a cognitive scientist working at the University of Connecticut.
Great. So I think I've known of your research for a while now, and I've always been fascinated by it. You focus on extreme ritual. Is that right?
Correct.
How would you describe your research?
Most of my work has focused on extreme rituals, and by extreme we don't mean anything that is pathological or abnormal. What I mean by this is rituals that are highly intense. So if you were to see all types of rituals that humans perform across cultures, on the spectrum of intensity in terms of how much effort and physical pain and suffering they involve, these would be outliers. So we're talking about things like walking on burning embers, walking on glass, piercing the body with needles, other forms of mutilation, and prolonged suffering.
Prolonged suffering, mutilation. Do you focus on a specific culture globally, or is it extreme ritual writ large?
Most of my work has focused on two areas. So, mostly for my doctoral research, I studied the far walking rituals of Southern Europe. So I did research mostly in Greece and Spain, and to some extent in Bulgaria. And for the last decade, I've been focusing on the rituals of the Tamil community in the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And these rituals involve things like piercing the body with hooks and needles and skewers, and also walking on fire and walking on the edges of knives and so on.
So when studying extreme rituals, what are you looking for? I know that you've focused on how extreme rituals help promote pro-social behavior, social cohesion. What's the angle that really comes out of this research?
What I really want to know is why. Well, it's the big question. Why do people do these things that seem to be, they have obvious costs. They're painful, they're stressful. Some of them have risks for their health, and they have no directly obvious benefits. So that doesn't make much sense. That leads us to think that if we probe a bit deeper, we'll find some benefits for those rituals. And in fact, that's what we find. To add to this puzzle, when you ask people why they perform these rituals, most of the time they'll just refer to tradition. They'll say, well, that's just what we do. I don't know why I do these rituals. We've always done those. My father has done them, and his father before him, and so on. But once you start probing a little bit more, then you find that people have some intuitions that these rituals, although they won't say that they do these rituals to boost social cohesion, they have a sense that when they go through these rituals, they feel closer to each other. They bond. Now, the question that I'm interested in studying is how do we test these ideas? How do we take something that either our participants say or either theory says, other anthropologists have said, and turn this into a measurable concept that we can then study in real life contexts?
Yeah, and how have you gone about doing that? I mean, you recently published an article for Eon, I think, the online magazine, and your approach was kind of a dual approach, where you were doing ethnography, like interviews, but also like empirical experimentation. I don't know if I'm misconstruing what your methodology was.
Yes. So the idea is that because these rituals, you can't study them in a laboratory setting. It's impossible for both practical and ethical reasons. You can imagine I cannot, although I'm running a lab at the University of Connecticut, I can't build a big fire in my lab and have people walk across it. So the idea then is that instead of taking people out of their natural context and moving them into a sterilized lab, why don't we try to move the lab into context by taking it in the field? So in my research, I've done things like measure physiological responses, heart rate, galvanic skin response, as people are practicing these rituals, or looking at what happens immediately after practicing these rituals, how much money they donate to charity, how they feel about one another, how their social identity might change.
Can you speak to some of those physiological changes? Like, do heartbeats sync up? Do body movements sync up during these extreme rituals?
Well, they do, and this is something that I found in at least two contexts. In a Sufi ritual in Istanbul, for example, where you have this synchronous movement. People dance together, they exhale, they chant together, and then you have this extraordinary synchrony in their physiological states and their heart rates. And that's to be expected. But it was more unexpected what we found in Spain, in the context of a fire walking ritual, looking at people who either were walking on the burning coals, or were simply watching, or were doing all sorts of other tasks. And then we see that there's an extraordinary degree of synchrony in their heart rates. So they go up and down at the same time, no matter what they're doing. And the other interesting thing we found is that when we mapped the social network of the area, so we asked people who their closest friends and relatives were, we see that we're able to predict the level of heart rate synchrony from the level of social proximity. That means that for the outsiders, those curious tourists who have come to see the ritual, we don't see any such effects. But for those who are members of the community, performing this ritual together leads in the synchronization of affective states, of emotional states, for the entire community, not just for those who practice them as performance.
So even the audience is essentially being affected by the ritual as well.
That's
with
correct.
The synchrony.
And this is something that we have seen in other kinds of studies. For example, in Mauritius, I did this study with a team of colleagues in the context of the Kawadi ritual. And this is a really painful ritual that involves piercing the body with hundreds of needles and skewers and hooks and even big rods the size of broomsticks, and carrying chariots that are attached to the skin through chains, and walking on shoes made of nails. And all this is happening under the burning tropical sun in Mauritius, which is a tropical island. And people walking barefooted or nails, and I don't know which one is worse, because under the tropical sun the asphalt is so much, it's so burning that it's impossible for me to take a single step. So in the context of this ritual, we wanted to see how suffering would affect performers of this ritual, but even the observers. And we compared this to other types of rituals that are of similar collective size, but differ radically in the level of arousal and suffering. So things like collective prayers, where there's no pain. And what we see is that when we look at the levels of charitable donations right after this ritual, they're much increased compared to other types of rituals.
So
and
people
in fact,
are more willing to give to charity after participating or viewing.
Correct. So we see that this extends to both active performers of this ritual and observers. So the entire community becomes more pro-social. We also see that among those who have done the piercings, the more pain they've experienced, the more money they give to charity.
That's interesting. So I'm a little bit familiar with the theory of costly signaling. I have at least one video on the channel where I talk about costly signaling. How does that play into this? Where is part of the reason why it promotes pro-social behavior because of the performance of a difficult, painful ritual, and that shows the person's commitment to the community?
I think it's a very important part of the story. In a more recent study that we have just submitted, actually, the paper's not out yet, we wanted to see who exactly produces these signals, so to speak. So we see that people who are of lower status within the community, therefore they have a greater need to enhance their status, they put more needles in their body. They participate more frequently in the Kawadi. They carry larger structures, which is part of the Kawadi ritual. It's a very heavy burden that you have to carry in a long procession, and so on and so forth. We also see that those who are more visible in the community, so those who participate in more public rituals, but not private rituals, are more likely to produce what we call a stronger signal. So again, they put more needles in their body when they're going to be seen by more people. And I think this fits pretty well with the idea of the concept of causality signaling. And others, people like L.E. Power, have done research in India looking at the same types of rituals, and they too find that when people perform these rituals, then they get the social benefits. So their reputation is enhanced. People see them as more trustworthy, for example, when they've done these rituals.
And in some respects, that might speak to like a Durkheimian perspective of religion, where the religious rituals playing into the group, it shows fealty to the group, kind of promotes the social cohesion of the group. So all this talk of promoting social cohesion, this talk about the audience matters just as much as the person performing the ritual, makes me think of Durkheim, where he says that religion is in many respects showing the obligation to the community. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that and other contexts where we could see this.
This is a very good point, and indeed Durkheim argued that these kinds of collective rituals are essentially an instance of the group worshipping itself, or society worshipping itself. And this is something we can see when we extend this concept of, we look at ritual in the context of things like sports, for example, where you have highly ritualized behavior among the fans. And if you spend some time with fanatic fans, as I have done during my youth, you will see that these groups to some extent become a form of worshipping the group itself. So it's not just about what's happening in the game, it's about what's happening in the terraces. These people dance together, they chant in synchrony, they go through collective arousal, and that helps them build a sense of community. It's one of the big puzzles of human nature. Why do we do these things? In the same sense that I'm asking why do we perform religious rituals, I'm asking that question of why do we have things like sports affiliation? Why do we care about our team? I think that it has a lot to do with these collective rituals that are performed. There's never been a couch potato fan that became a hooligan. If you look at the radicalization of those movements and the instances where you have things like street fights that break out among fans and hooliganism, which is something very common in places like Europe and South America, these strong identities and this sense of hostility towards the outgroup is forged through participation in those collective rituals.
My own dissertation research focuses on this a little bit, but in an ancient context where a lot of magical objects, amulets, inscriptions that are meant to defend your house from demons have group chants inscribed on the amulet. So a shout or a chant that would have been performed in a liturgy or a stadium. And I make a similar argument where this idea of the group coming together generates a collective power, an almost magical power that you can then materialize onto an amulet. So I can see kind of a similar through line here where the collective ritual, it's the performance that matters, and it's not just the performance, but the performance in a group that generates this empowerment.
That's correct. I tend to see these high-intensity collective rituals as social technologies, and as any kind of technology, they can be used for good or for bad. And this is why we see from time immemorial that these rituals have been used not just by religions, but by all sorts of organizations like militaries, gangs, fraternities, and what have you. And they can be used to bring about a sense of community and increase bonding with the in-group, but the flip side of that is that they can also be used to increase hostility towards an out-group.